the newsagents.
We know there is fury about the bid by a former head of CNN, backed by money from one of the sheikhs in Abu Dhabi, to buy the Daily Telegraph and The Spectator. The Conservative firmament has been in a state of rage. But what we haven't heard from until now is from Jeff Zucker himself, the former head of CNN, who is leading the bid to take over the Telegraph and take it to America, and that his rival bidder, Paul Marshall, the hedge fund billionaire, is not a fit and proper person to own the newspaper group. Welcome to the Newsagents. It's John in Washington.
And it's Lewis in Newsagents HQ. And in a way, the interview that you're about to hear, which John has done with Jeff Zucker, is kind of a continuation of the story. You might remember our exclusive story that we did about Paul Marshall, who, as John said, is one of the rival bidders for the Telegraph and Spectator. He's one of the big investors in GB News. Paul Marshall, as you'll remember, we reported along with Hope Not Hate, is a pretty controversial figure. Why? Well, one of the reasons why, not only because of his big investments in GB News, which is itself controversial, but because, as we reported, we found that he had been retweeting material which was extremist, which was far right, which was Islamophobic, and which was homophobic as well. So we have been reporting on this story for a while on the Newsagents because it matters so much, really, who owns the Daily Telegraph and the Spectator. You might be thinking, who cares? It matters because it is not only one of the biggest newspaper businesses in Britain, but also because it is perhaps the most influential stable of conservative publications in the UK, and enormously influential, in particular, over the future direction of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, and Jeff Zucker has kept very quiet until now. And I think actually largely because of, Lewis, your reporting on Paul Marshall, he decided, you know what, I'm not just going to sit in a crouch position. I am going to come out. And he's come out at a critical time because on Monday, the Culture Secretary will get the report from the Competition and Markets Authority and Ofcom about the bid of this PIIN, a Public Interest Intervention Notice. And then Lucy Fraser will have to decide whether she thinks there are still major problems with the bid, in which case, you know, it goes back to Jeff Zucker's company to reframe it or whatever, or meet those assurances. And essentially, the company is set up like this. RedBird is a private equity firm that Zucker set up himself after he left CNN. IMI is the private investment vehicle of Sheikh Mansour, who is a key figure in the running of Abu Dhabi. But it's not a government sovereign wealth fund as such, but it's still controversial.
Yeah, so to really distill this story to its purest in terms of the kind of two sides of this, on the one hand, you've got a group of people led by, among other people, Andrew Neil, currently the chairman of The Spectator, but lots of the other kind of establishment figures in the kind of right-wing firmament, the kind of conservative family, people like Charles Moore, the former editor of The Telegraph and so on, saying, we will not tolerate, Britain cannot allow one of its biggest newspapers to be bought with money that they say is basically from, and it kind of sort of is, from a foreign state, from the UAE, and they allege all kind of potential conflicts of interest that may arise in terms of the reporting of the Telegraph on the UAE and Gulf money and all of the rest of it. And then on the other hand, you've got people like Jeff Zucker, but also other people, including potentially George Osborne, the former Chancellor, going around saying, well, actually, this isn't nearly as big a problem as you might think, and others saying what would be a bigger problem is having like someone like Paul Marshall, the owner of GB News, buy it with the views that he has, or Rupert Murdoch, or the owner of the Daily Mail, Lord Rothermere, because then that means you've got too much concentration of too many newspapers in too few hands.
So I sat down with Jeff Zucker and put all these issues to him and the way he thinks the bid has been misrepresented, and also his views on Andrew Neil and Paul Marshall, and he is very candid. Jeff Zucker, it's great to have you on the Newsagents. Thank you so much for being with us. You are facing some pretty serious headwinds on this bid from the Conservative establishment.
Well, John, thanks for having me on, and I appreciate the opportunity. Obviously, look, there's been a serious campaign against us for quite some time now, but we're committed to the process, and we think that we have a very good business plan in place to help both the Telegraph and the Spectator. And I think that we have confidence in the process. We are committed to seeing the process through. And I think that if there was a better understanding of really what we're trying to do here, then there would be less opposition. And we're confident in the end that this will work out.
What is misunderstood?
Look, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here of how this is all set up. The reality is that our bid is a joint venture bid between an American-led private equity firm and a business entity in the United Arab Emirates called IMI. This is not the UAE government that is investing in the Telegraph and the Spectator. And it is a joint venture led by me with 35 years of experience and all of the safeguards in place for people who don't believe that IMI will continue to be a passive investor. They have absolutely no say in either the editorial or operational parts of the business. And for those who don't trust that, there is a second layer of safeguard in place with an editorial trust board that has the strongest protections of any UK newspaper. So I just think there's a fundamental misunderstanding of both who is investing here and why we're doing it.
But the argument goes that Sheikh Mansour, who is behind the IMI investment fund, is going to have 75% holding. He's not just going to take no interest in what happens. And down the ages, there have been boards set up to kind of keep editorial independence, and they've never really worked.
We've put in place and guaranteed the strongest editorial protections of any UK newspaper. And we are making those undertakings to the government, and the government can hold us responsible if we don't live up to them.
Let's take a hypothetical situation. There is a scandal surrounding Manchester City Football Club. Manchester City Football Club is owned by Sheikh Mansour, who will have a 75% stake in the Daily Telegraph. You're not seriously telling me Telegraph journalists will be at the forefront of an investigation, are you?
I think there's no question they will be. First of all, have you seen the Telegraph's coverage of this deal? I think they've proven their independence thus far. And when we own it, I think that you and I have been around newsrooms forever. I think that the reality is that when newsrooms are concerned about their independence, they actually cover the issues of their ownership even harder. And the editors and the editorial staff of the Telegraph will have full independence to cover whatever story they feel is necessary. And I can tell you that IMI's leadership, which will have no say, understands this, that is the cost of entry here. And so, whatever hypothetical situation comes up, I am confident that the Telegraph will cover aggressively and with all the vigor that the Telegraph has brought to its investigative journalism through the years. So let's call it as it is. I am totally comfortable, confident, and believe that the coverage of the UAE will be as strong and independent as is necessary.
Andrew Neil, sometimes media executive, chairman of The Spectator, who I know you've met, said the idea that these two vital vehicles of mainstream centre-right thought should be owned by Arab money and controlled out of New York by a left-wing Democrat beggars belief. He says the idea is absurd.
Yeah, well, this may come as a shock, but Andrew Neil is quite the hypocrite on this. And let me tell you a story about why that's the case. Because let's be very clear here, and I have not talked about this publicly before. The reality is that Andrew Neil was interested in working with us until we didn't have any interest in having him work with us. I proposed to him after we met that he be the chair of an editorial trust board for The Spectator. He said that was too small for him because he already essentially had that role. But he did say to me that he'd be interested in being the chair of a combined editorial trust board for the Telegraph and The Spectator, and suggested that In that role, he could also act as a shadow editor of the Telegraph because he felt the newspaper needed one. He also wanted to know how much such a role would pay. We said no thanks. And ever since that day, he's been one of our most vocal critics. And I think that says all you need to know about Andrew Neil. And since I am sure that he's going to deny this and pretend that didn't happen and make all kinds of threats, let me be very clear about something. He did not make that request just of me. I am not the only one that he had that conversation with. And I can also tell you that when I spoke to folks at both the Telegraph and the Spectator about his potential involvement, they were all quite pleased to learn that he would not be around. So now you know the full story. And so please, give me a break with the hypocrisy.
So that is quite the accusation you are making about Andrew Neil, because he has been an implacable opponent, and you're saying he wanted to be at the heart of it.
He did. I'm not making an accusation. Accusations are things that aren't true. What I'm telling you is a true story of what happened.
Verifiably.
Well, again, as I said to you, I'm not the only one that he made the request of, that he wanted to chair a combined editorial trust board of both the Telegraph and the Spectator.
Do you feel you've come across hypocrisy as well from others who think your bid is improper? Because, look, 100 Conservative MPs have signed a motion saying this should not happen. And it's not just the Conservative MPs. There have been Liberal Democrats and Labour as well. And the thing they argue is there has never been a foreign government that has taken over another country's media company. If CNN was going to have been bought by the UAE, the US government would have never allowed it.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that's entirely true, but put that to the side. Again, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I do think that in the media space, some of our biggest critics have been those who have also approached us to see if we would be open to bringing them in as partners in this deal. So that's one thing. And as far as those folks, in the parliament who have voiced their opposition to it, I mean, obviously, look, we respect their ability and their right to do so. I do think, again, as we talked about at the beginning, I think it all comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of really what this deal is. You repeated it; it's just not true. This is not the UAE government that is buying the Telegraph. So again, I think this all comes down to a real misunderstanding of the structure of the deal and what is in place to protect it.
You seem to suggest it's a willful misunderstanding. What do you think lies behind it? Because the other principal bidder, as we understand it, for the Telegraph and Spectator group is the British hedge fund billionaire Paul Marshall.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. Let me say this. I don't know if there's a willful misunderstanding on the part of those in Parliament and those who have opposed it. I think that there just may be a misunderstanding, and that doesn't mean that it's willful. And so I don't want to ascribe that motivation to it on their part. The reality is, the many people who I've spoken to who do begin to have a better understanding of who's behind this and how it's structured do come away with a much better feeling about what's proposed here. Now, with regard to other suitors for the Telegraph, I mean, I think you rightly ask or raise the question, which is something I think everybody should be asking, is, okay, you're opposed to this to this bid, then who is the right owner for the Telegraph? We know that the previous owners, the Barclays, is not a viable option. We know that the owners of other newspaper groups like the Daily Mail Group or News UK aren't viable on plurality grounds. And just last week, your podcast, this one that I'm speaking to you on right here, exposed finally that Paul Marshall is unfit to own a newspaper. So and that was clear from what your reporting last week exposed. We are clearly the best option for the Telegraph and the Spectator, and the only ones who have said that we will come along and we will invest at a time when media is under tremendous duress.
Jeff, I hear what you say, but I want to ask you this. Why would anyone invest in a newspaper? I mean, the old joke, how do you make a small fortune as a newspaper owner? You start out with a large fortune.
Yeah. So look, John, it's a really good question. I understand it. I think that what people don't recognize about the Telegraph is that it's already a very good business and quite profitable. We also think with the proper amount of investment, we can make that profit even greater. And we have plans to invest at a time when there's not a lot of investment going into UK media. One of those plans is to invest in the journalism both in the UK and to bring the Telegraph center-right brand into America. We actually think that there's a real opening in the United States for a very strong center-right brand. Much as The Guardian has moved into the US with its quite left positioning, we think that the center-right is a real gap in the marketplace in the US. And I think the brand and the strength of the Telegraph brand presents us with an opportunity to really move into America in a significant way. That's one of the things that we're excited about. That's one of the reasons we want to do this deal. That's one of the things that we think will be great for the Telegraph brand itself. And so we think that exporting the Telegraph brand outside the UK is something that should excite everybody, both at the Telegraph and in the UK.
But I guess the argument is still, if you look at the history of newspaper ownership, very wealthy people have bought newspapers for influence and to kind of have a voice, to be able to affect politics, whether it be Rupert Murdoch or the Rothermeres or the Beaverbrooks in British history. They are the people who want to earn newspapers. They've made a fortune. They want influence. Isn't it right that we should view Sheikh Mansour exactly through that lens?
No, I don't think so, because again, I think it doesn't understand that RedBird IMI was set up more than a year ago, before the Telegraph was even for sale, as a commercial joint venture that was looking for media opportunities across news and information and entertainment across the global landscape for commercial returns. And then the Telegraph came along and we looked at it, and we would not have pursued it if we didn't think that we could continue to have a good commercial return on this property. And so and then RedBird comes in as part of this and has its own fiduciary responsibility to its own investors. So we didn't have to do this. And by the way, remember, the UAE doesn't have to own a newspaper in the UK to have influence. It already is a very close ally. It doesn't need a newspaper. And the fact is that IMI is not the UAE. So again, it's a business of one of the leaders of UAE that is set up for commercial returns. So I don't accept the premise that there's not a business opportunity here for us.
No, Jeff, I've been looking through the sort of list of acquisitions that have been made by RedBird IMI since you left CNN and started this vehicle up. Is this worth the hassle?
Well, look, we've been at this for about 14 months. We've made 5 acquisitions already. We are not stopping, and we're not letting this get in the way of continuing to do what we set out to do. Look, obviously this has been a longer process than we expected, but we believe it's the right thing. We believe it's the right thing for the Telegraph, and we'll continue to see it through. But it's also not going to preclude us from moving along and doing other deals and doing other things and running the 5 companies that we've already invested in.
Can I finally take you back to your old job at CNN? And we've got the 2024 election coming up. You had big choices to make: how you would cover Trump in 16, and 2020, and I think you would accept now that maybe particularly in 2016, you got it wrong. How should TV companies cover him now?
Well, John, I don't know that we got it entirely wrong. I've been very vocal and very honest about the fact that we didn't get it entirely right, but we didn't get it entirely wrong. I've said publicly that we provided too much free campaign exposure to Trump at that time, and that if I could do it again, we wouldn't have given him as much free access and extraordinary coverage of his rallies and speeches like that. Now, by the way, everybody copied what we did. I'm the only one who has stood up and said, that was a mistake. I think we learned from that in 2020, and I think as you move here into the coverage in 2024, I think it's critical that that those mistakes not be repeated, and that he not be given unfettered access to tell things that aren't true. Now, he is the Republican candidate for president of the United States. You can't ignore him. You can't pretend that he doesn't exist. But I think you have to bring a much more discerning and critical approach to it. That doesn't mean that you should take all of his speeches live. I think that his proclivity and propensity to not tell the truth means that he hasn't earned that right. And so I think that you cover him. I think you report what he has said, but you don't give him live, unfettered access to your airwaves. And I think that, what I believed always in 2016 and 2020 was that we were pro-truth. And I think it is imperative that any journalistic outlet be more than anything pro-truth.
Isn't the problem, I think it was your counterpart at CBS, Les Moonves, who said, he may be a terrible human being, but he's great for business. And that actually, if you want eyeballs on your television sets, as an executive in any TV company does, Trump rallies present jeopardy, risk, uncertainty, whereas, with everyone else, you just get a stump speech.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, I think, first of all, that was an inappropriate comment about, what was good for America and what was good for business. The reality is, I believe that it's journalistic organizations should stand first and foremost for the truth. I think that these are businesses, and that you do have to run your business, and I don't think those things are mutually exclusive.
Can I ask you a cheeky final question, which is, do you feel in any way responsible for Donald Trump? He came to prominence in the US because of The Apprentice. Yeah, he'd been in the gossip columns and on page 6 before that. But you greenlit The Apprentice, you were then at CNN. Some people would say, Jeff Zucker, for all the heat you've taken from Donald Trump, you helped create him.
So first of all, I don't take it as a cheeky question. Look, the reality is I did greenlight The Apprentice. I know Donald Trump as well as anybody in the United States. I do not feel that is why he is president of the United States, and I think that really diminishes his following and his ability to move people. If you want to say he's only president of the United States because he came to notoriety because of The Apprentice and things like that. The reality is it's much more complicated than that. I do find great irony in the fact that people want to say, oh, you guys were too hard on him at CNN because you fact checked him all the time. Those are we've got half the country that thinks I'm responsible for Donald Trump, and half the country that thinks we were too tough on Donald Trump. So in the end, I think we probably did something right.
Jeff Zucker, I'm grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Good to talk to you, John. Thanks for having me.
Right, well, wow, that was quite the conversation, John. I mean, we should say, it's rare to hear from Zucker. He's a big player, big media player in the United States and potentially in the future in the UK. Rare to hear from him, but he was extremely candid about pretty much everything.
Yes, I kind of wondered how much I'd have to really prize and tease out, kind of like you do in a political interview. And I think he'd had enough. I think he'd had enough of the accusations that were coming his way. And I just think he thought, you know what? I've got nothing to lose. I want to set the record straight. The bid has been misrepresented. Andrew Neil he, in his eyes, has been an absolute hypocrite, and that Paul Marshall wasn't a fit person. And I thought it was also interesting, actually, on the business plan that they've got for how they would make the Telegraph into this kind of much bigger vehicle. And I thought the stuff about it being kind of like the Guardian of the centre right in the US was an interesting idea, because the Guardian is huge here.
Yeah, that is really, really interesting. And I think you can, in a way with this story, you can kind of see the kind of cleavages, can't you, of the modern right, in a sense that, you know, there is a feeling from some, particularly on the more, you might say, I don't know, more establishment centre-right bit of the Conservative Party, that the Telegraph has started to go down quite a radical direction, that it started to engage and endorse, particularly since Brexit, quite radical anti-institutional ideas, you know, dabbled with the kind of Truss agenda and all of that sort of thing, and that maybe this bid could be a means, basically, of tempering that and bringing it back to a more centre-right direction. And then on the other hand, perhaps more radical forces, or certainly more novel forces within the Conservative Party on the right of the Conservative Party, looking potentially to a Paul Marshall bid or someone else to continue and perhaps expand the kind of new emphasis of the Telegraph.
I think that is absolutely spot on. I mean, speaking to some of those people around the bid, because, you know, this conversation just didn't come out of the blue. I've been talking to various people about it. Their view is that actually the Telegraph journalists, the reporters, the kind of correspondents, are really keen for this bid to happen, because they see this is a way of getting a huge amount of new investment into the paper. The idea of America is quite exciting. And yet at the top of the paper, the opinion formers, leaders, columnists are dead against it, because they are allied with the kind of Truss wing of the Conservative Party, the sort of Lee Anderson wing, and they think Paul Marshall would be the perfect fit to kind of take the Telegraph in a radical direction. And so you really do have a fundamental question here about who is a fit and proper person to own a newspaper. Because as I said in the interview with Zucker, go down the ages, the Beaver Brooks and all the rest of them, the Rothermeres, the Murdochs, you know, whoever, they've always bought newspapers for influence. He is saying, no. We're not about influence. We're about making money.
And I think that is, again, just to reiterate, I think why this story really matters is because there are players and thinkers and power brokers within the Conservative Party and the Conservative family who are thinking very actively, as they should, about a post-Sunak world, a world where the Conservative Party is probably in opposition and what direction that takes. And in that world, in that context, the Telegraph and its editorial disposition and attitude, and the Spectator as well, will be absolutely pivotal. So who owns it really matters. So this is all part of the kind of preamble to that fight, and making sure from each side that the Telegraph is on their side of the column. I mean, Andrew Neil is the one, in a way, John, who is such an interesting kind of figure in this, because you can't exactly say exactly where he would sit in terms of either of those two camps ideologically. He's quite mercurial in that way. But if you haven't been following this, and, you know, can understand if you haven't, but Neil has been the most vociferous, assiduous opponent of the RedBird IMI bid and of Zucker. And he has been taking to all the TV studios, the radio studios, and definitely having endless conversations with ministers and MPs, telling them that this isn't acceptable because it is a line to cross, having foreign state money buying a newspaper.
Well, let's hear from Andrew Neil, because we obviously approached him following Jeff Zucker's accusations that he was a hypocrite, that he was seeking a big job, that he wanted to talk how much money he would be earning, etc. This is the statement, and it's a long statement, so bear with us, from Andrew Neil. Mr Zucker's memory is playing tricks on him. He never offered me chair of a Spectator editorial trust. He vaguely mentioned being a member of such a trust. I said I'd rather walk than take such a diminution in my current role. That was on January the 3rd and ended the matter. He's never been in touch since. At no stage did I ever suggest I should chair a combined Telegraph Spectator trust. Why would I? I have no interest in a role solely designed to give Mr Zucker editorial credibility, which he lacks.
And it goes on. As for shadow editor of the Telegraph, I have never heard such a phrase and have no idea what it means, so I could hardly suggest it for myself. Mr Zucker, who never used the phrase with me, has clearly invented something which does not exist in UK newspapers or magazines. Yet more proof he hasn't a clue about UK publishing and is merely a frontman for the UAE bankrollers. I have made it clear I will have nothing to do with it and will walk away in the unlikely event he succeeds in acquiring The Spectator.
And it goes on. Still, we're not there yet. Mr Zucker says, I wanted to know how much I'd be paid. That is a lie. At no stage in the 2 contacts I've ever had with him, one short meeting in New York City, one transatlantic phone call, was there ever a word about remuneration. How could there be when we never came close to agreeing any role for me in his planned operation? And it goes on. Since Mr Zucker has subsequently made it clear that he will not establish a trust for The Spectator, though he will for the Telegraph, then he was offering me a role on a body he doesn't intend to create. So I don't know what he was up to. I'm not sure he does either. Ends.
Yeah, so Andrew Neil, very strongly denying what Zucker has told us. And of course, this is very much a kind of he said, she said kind of affair. We can't obviously know the truth, although Mr Zucker obviously was implying that there were other people who were aware of what was going on. It'd be interesting to see if any further evidence come forward about that. But it is it just shows how intense and acrimonious this fissure and this battle for this massive newspaper business, which, as we say, is very, very, very influential, is getting, and it is going right up to the heart of government.
And my guess is, if I was to punt on it, I think that no decision will be taken this side of a general election. The can is going to get kicked down the road, or as kind of put it in Zucker's term, it's going to be punted down the field. I just can't see that they're going to make a swift judgment on this. Well, maybe they will. Maybe if they make a swift judgment, it will be to say that as things stand, the bid is not satisfactory, and therefore there needs to be a lot more work on it. And what I don't know is, what is the commitment of Zucker and RedBird IMI to proceed with this to the very end. But as you say, Lewis, it's a bit he said, she said, but Jeff Zucker did make it clear that there was another party who'd had a very similar conversation with Mr Neil, and it remains to be seen whether whoever that is decides to come forward.
I mean, I suppose in a way, the sort of big macro issue around this, isn't there, John, is that we are living in a world where we are seeing the rapidly growing influence of Middle Eastern money, Gulf money in particular. It is infusing into every walk of life and industry after industry across the West. And in that context, it probably would be odd if at some point these big legacy media titles, which we know are extremely appealing to certain types of investors from places like the Gulf, weren't on the table, particularly in a world where, as we know better than anyone, it is so difficult for media organisations, even previously big titles like the Telegraph and the Telegraph Group and the Barclay brothers, who are the current owners, to compete in a world of the monolithic media organisations, the Disneys and the Amazons and the Apples and the rest of it. So this is a kind of foretaste, potentially, of what's to come.
And the interesting thing about Britain compared to the United States, I mean, I was here when I think it was the Port Authority of Dubai was looking to take over the running of the Port of Baltimore. And you thought, well, it's kind of just a small bit of business. The US said, no way. The US said this is critical US infrastructure. There is no way there can be a foreign owner. There is much more economic nationalism and protectionism and concern about national security in America than there is in Britain. And that is why you can have the French or the Chinese building power stations. You can have, all these Gulf states buying up football clubs, which might seem kind of a trivial matter, but it is soft power that the Gulf states are looking for by owning Newcastle United or Manchester City or whoever it happens to be. And this is kind of, as you say, a trend that is happening with these super wealthy sovereign wealth funds or super wealthy individuals who can throw this sort of money around.
Nothing compared to your personal wealth, of course, John. I'm surprised you haven't been asked to put a bid in. Have you ruled that out, by the way? Have you ruled it out?
I can barely afford to buy one copy of the Beano.
Beano. Honestly, yeah. What's next? Copy of Razzle? All right, we will be back just after this.
So obviously, last night in Washington, it was the big set piece. It was Joe Biden's State of the Union. And never has so much focus been on style rather than substance. Because we all wanted to see whether Joe Biden was literally going to survive the night, whether he would fall over, whether he would stumble, whether it would be a kind of absolute catastrophe. As it happens, the bar had been set so low. I'm not going to say that Biden leapt over it, but Biden did kind of do brilliantly last night. And he really took the fight to Donald Trump. So this was a raw, political, bare-knuckle fight. And Joe Biden came out swinging last night. And I think that it's a foretaste of what the election is going to be like. It was a very, very political State of the Union speech. It was less about reaching across the aisle than laying into those people who have blocked aid to Ukraine, who have overturned abortion law, who are in denial about what happened on January the 6th. And so today, on the Democrat side, everyone is utterly cock-a-hoop about Joe Biden's performance. And in Trump land, weirdly, they are complaining that the speech wasn't bipartisan enough. From Donald Trump, the man who was the great consensus builder.
Like you say, John, the expectations were so low. I mean, I watched quite a bit of it this morning. And I actually thought, in fairness to Biden, he did what he needed to do in a sense that he proved that there is life in the old dog yet. You know, that he still has political fight in him. Yes, the expectations had been lowered so much because people worried, quite frankly, if he would come out and remember his own name or what his job was. But he not only showed that he still had fight, he also showed that he had an argument that he was willing to put, and he would prosecute that argument fiercely. And obviously one of the big questions is about his age, and that is going to be one of the dominant themes of the campaign. That is partly what the speech was setting out to address. This is a bit of what he said about that.
I know it may not look like it, but I've been around a while. When you get to be my age, certain things become clearer than ever. I know the American story. Again and again, I've seen the contest between competing forces in the battle for the soul of our nation, between those who want to pull America back to the past and those who want to move America into the future. My lifetime has taught me to embrace freedom and democracy, a future based on core values that have defined America: honesty, decency, dignity, equality, to respect everyone, to give everyone a fair shot, to give hate no safe harbor.
I thought what you said, John, there about what the Republicans say is really, really interesting, because it shows that that the legacy of Trump and the kind of politics and the atmosphere of politics that Trump has created or contributed a large part in creating has already changed not only clearly the institutions and structures of American politics, but the Democratic Party as well. I mean, what I was thinking watching that, where you got a speech where Biden is so on the offensive, so raucous, so happy to take heckles, in what used to be an extremely kind of ceremonial, quite portentous kind of occasion. I mean, I remember I was in Washington in 2009 doing an internship, right? I was still at university, and do you remember it was the summer of the Obamacare debates? And Obama it wasn't a State of the Union, but it was a special session of Congress. It was basically like an emergency State of the Union. And it was in that the famously, this is obviously pre-Trump, but famously the Republican congressman shouted out, "Obama, you lie." And it was complete shock. You could have heard a pin drop in the House of Representatives that evening, and it became the big news about the kind of coarsening of American politics and about how standards were becoming low, and how could someone have ever interrupted the president? God, that seems like a different political era now. It seems like sort of the run-up to the Civil War or something in the 19th century. Lincoln hadn't been president yet. It seems that remote and far long ago. The mores of American politics are just so transformed, and Biden has just responded to that and actually lent into it.
You talk about the coarsening of politics. Before we go, I guess we ought to talk about Theresa May leaving Westminster, a prime minister who arguably was brought down by the coarsening of politics by having people around her in her own Conservative Party who just wanted to tear down what she was trying to do, which was to somehow deliver a Brexit that kind of represented the 52-48 split in the country, and failed miserably because she didn't have the wherewithal, and so many of her party was so against her.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, obviously, Theresa May becomes, I think there's now over 60 Conservative MPs who are saying they're not going to stand again, and there will be more to come as well. So obviously, people are looking into it and saying, well, it's just another example of a Conservative MP who doesn't much fancy a spell on the opposition benches. She did a long period of that in the run-up to the 2010 election. She knows how fruitless it can be, so she wants to get out. Some people saying as well, maybe she's worried about her Maidenhead seat. And in a way, I think that you can't read too much into this May resignation in that way in particular, because she's been a former Prime Minister. What more has she got to achieve in the Commons? So one thing, though, that she has done, it's an interesting example, actually, of how you can reshape your reputation slightly from within the Commons. If she had left as Cameron did, and say George Osborne did so immediately, or even Tony Blair so immediately after they stood down as being Prime Minister, I think she would have been, the sense of failure about her and her reputation for failure would have been even more amplified. The fact that she actually pulled off quite a smart trick, really. She's not only kind of somewhat rehabilitated herself by being seen to still be, a constituency MP, and she cares about that work, and she already always has done, got involved with parliamentary bills as they've come through, criticised Boris Johnson, some of her successes where appropriate. She also made quite a lot of money on the side, very quietly, by the way, on the speech circuit, in a way that former PMs often get criticised for. But she's managed to augment her reputation a little bit by comparison to where it was in 2019. But of course, everyone will always, and she will have to live with this. Her political career, and historians will always come back to that decision in 2017 to have that election which shattered her authority and from which she never ever could recover. And that will always be, she will always have to live with that, and that will be the kind of crucial tipping point in terms of her political career, and she'll have to wonder the counterfactual about what might have been.
Right. I'm going to go and have some breakfast now. I'll see you next week, Lewis.
All right. Well, you enjoy your breakfast, John.
Thank you.
Yeah, and you must keep me updated on your progress of the bid when we get back.
Still got some way to run. Interesting story. Look, take care. Have a good weekend. Bye.
See you next week. Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.